Well, hello folks, here we are in the third video of our trilogy, looking at what happens with these changes that occur. So we know that there's different types of prezygotic and postzygotic isolation that occurs between populations, and we want to think about how can this isolation lead to these changes. Now, the isolation typically comes in one of two forms. It's referred to as Sympatric or Allopatric speciation. Now, the prefix allo means other, and then pater means country. So with allopatric speciation, there's basically geographic isolation. There's a physical barrier that separates the populations. So again, allopatric speciation, just know that the populations are physically separated from one another. And so over time, they're going to adapt to those different environments. So in this previous image, maybe the pond or the lake changes in such a way that it cuts off two subpopulations. So you have the sort of aquafish and the orange fish, and over time, well, here's your ancestral population, I'm sorry, your original population. It's all these orange fish, but then they're physically separated from one another, so the subpopulations can't interact or interbreed, and then mutations accumulate. So that's the notion of allopatric speciation. As an example, there are a couple of ground squirrel species that were separated by the Colorado River during the formation of the Grand Canyon, and so those populations have had gene flow cut off between them, and the mutations have started to accumulate over time. They're studying them now because people have put in some land bridges or spots across the river, so there's opportunity for these populations to interact with one another. So we'll have to sort of see what happens with that. So again, the idea of allopatric speciation is you have this original ancestral population, and then some sort of physical barrier emerges, and then over time populations adapt in different ways for those different environments, and the populations become sufficiently different to be reproductively isolated, and we've got new species. Let's see, with sympatric speciation. Sympatric means same country. So the populations are around one another, but something's changing, so they're not reproducing with one another. So it could be that temporal isolation where there's differences in timing. It could be behavioral isolation where they have different mating rituals, whatever the case may be. So there's still physical contact between the populations, but they stop breeding with one another, and that limits gene flow. Ragelitis is a type of fruit fly. There's sort of interesting study with those. The ancestral population fed on hawthorn berries, which are native to North America. But then in the, I think it was 1700s, early 1700s, early 1800s, somewhere in there, people started bringing apple trees to the United States. And then when apple trees came to the U.S., some of this ancestral fruit fly population, the Ragelitis population, started feeding on the fruits of apples. And hawthorn berries and apples, the fruit set at different times of the year. So one population sort of stuck with the hawthorn berries. Another population started feeding on the apples. And those populations have become reproductively isolated. One funky thing about fruit flies, they got preferences. Fruit flies prefer to mate with other fruit flies that grew up eating the same type of fruit as them. So fruit flies that grew up feeding on hawthorn berries tend to prefer to mate with other fruit flies that fed on hawthorn berries. And it's the same with the subpopulation that fed on apples. They prefer to mate with other fruit flies that fed on apples. So there's a bit of temporal isolation in terms of when the fruit's set, and then that contributes to behavioral isolation. All that said, these populations are mating with one another less and less frequently, and they're starting to accumulate more and more differences with one another. Now, a fair question is, okay, if this change is afoot, if these populations are either physically or otherwise separated from one another and start to accumulate differences, is that going to lead to the creation of new species? And best answer in biology, of course, is it sort of depends. I think this image from the book here does a really nice job of sort of providing the idea. So here are three populations, and the arrows show gene flow between them. So organisms generally stay in their population, but some may wander off and mate with other individuals in other populations. So it keeps the populations from being reproductively isolated from one another. But if some sort of barrier occurs, whether it's timing for when they mate or behavior or changes in the gametes, or again, like physical separation, one subpopulation that's isolated may start to accumulate mutations and therefore differences over time. Now, these can be random mutations, or it can, of course, be through natural selection where they start to adapt to a different environment. But that population starts to change. Now, if circumstances are such that those populations are brought back in contact with one another and they're still able to produce fertile offspring, hybrid fertile offspring, then we wouldn't think that speciation has necessarily occurred yet. So if we look at in sort of the future here, you can keep having differences accumulate and hybrid offspring become rarer and rarer. Eventually, those populations are probably going to become distinct species. You can have populations become isolated and start to accumulate differences, but if they're brought back in regular contact with one another, then those differences diminish and the populations fuse, and it, of course, remains one species. Or again, if populations become divided and there's some limited contact, that maintains that stability over time. There's an interesting example of this with a couple of shark species off the coast of Australia. There were these different shark populations that were treated as different species, but with climate change, sort of patterns in water or ocean currents have occurred, and that's brought these shark populations together. And what do you know? They're producing hybrid offspring. So we're identifying cases and where researchers are identifying cases and where these sorts of things are occurring. But reproductive isolation is sort of the wedge. And what happens over time, well, it just sort of depends on the circumstances. You got to read your story problems. Looking at some examples of speciation that's been documented. When the landmass in Panama separated the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, that's definitely going to be geographic isolation, right? So you have these populations that are physically cut off from one another. So these shrimp species have been reproductively isolated, and they've been able to accumulate differences over time. Here, what could possibly be more terrifying than a polar bear or a grizzly bear? Polar bears. The hybrid offspring between a polar bear and a grizzly bear. Again, with climate change, ice flows are diminishing and polar bears are moving further and further south in order to survive. And what's happening is, well, they're coming in contact with grizzly bears and producing hybrid offspring that are fertile. So if we look at our biological species definition, if our polar bears and grizzly bears are producing fertile offspring, well then from a biological species definition, we may need to sort of think about how we classify these two species or populations. And sort of a thing to note here, we talked earlier about how horses and donkeys can produce mules that are infertile. So again, that's sort of like a dead end. Well, the common ancestor for the populations for modern horses and modern donkeys split from a common ancestor about 2.5 million years ago. For polar bears and grizzly bears, they split from a common ancestor only about 150,000 years ago. So they haven't had as much time to accumulate as many differences. So that sort of takes us back to this earlier image where you've had polar bears and grizzly bears separated from one another, and they've accumulated differences over time. You could look at a polar bear and a grizzly bear and see that they're definitely different from one another. But they can produce these fertile hybrid offspring. And what's going to happen in the future? Well, it probably depends on what the environment does, right? So here's a great example of how changes in the environment can impact evolutionary change in populations. Here's another sort of documented case. The book brings up stuff in research that sort of shows what people have found related to different populations. So you can go to Madeira off the coast of Portugal if you want to have a vacation, Or if you're smart, you can sort of book research on these sort of tropical places, so you can have a nice time while you're also sort of studying in your area of interest. But anyway, they looked at these mouse populations on the island. Now, the relief map here doesn't quite do it justice. Here's the island, and you can see it's pretty mountainous in the middle. So there's geographic isolation that has physically separated the mouse populations, and they've had enough opportunity to accumulate differences in their chromosomes. And so that can lead to like allopatric speciation. So if they're physically separated on the island, then they can start to accumulate these other differences over time, and that will lead to further reproductive isolation. We've seen examples of changes occur through sort of human agriculture as well. Here you see the image of einkorn. This is the first wheat that was domesticated by humans like 10 or 12,000 years ago. And you see here, these are the wheat berries. This is what gets crushed up and used to make flour. Plants, they sort of go along to get along. Plants, they're sort of rooted in the ground, and so reproduction becomes a little varied, and plants are actually pretty accepting of extra sets of chromosomes. So over time, humans have bred different populations of wheat with one another to create hybrid offspring that have characteristics that we're more interested in. So again, you see the einkorn wheat from the dawn of agriculture. And then you see the modern wheat where we have these huge wheat berries that are much higher yield, so you get a lot more flour or more grain, and it has a higher amount of gluten, that protein that sort of traps air bubbles and helps bread rise and gives bread textures that we like. This is going back to our fruit flies and their preferences. I said earlier that fruit flies, they prefer to mate with other fruit flies that fed on the same type of food as them growing up. And researchers do this experimentally as well. Here, if we look, female and male fruit flies prefer other flies that grew up eating the same type of food, whether it's growing up eating starch or both growing up eating maltose. If they're all fed the same thing, then they show no preference in terms of mating. So that may be a clue as to kind of things that show up on the test. Now, here is a great question. Relatively speaking, how fast does speciation occur? Now, we know that with grizzly bears and polar bears, they split 150,000 years ago from a common ancestor, but they're still able to produce fertile offspring. So when we think of time scales for like full speciation where there's complete reproductive isolation, man, that is going to take time. But the time scales we're looking at here, they're on the course of millions or tens of millions of years. So relatively speaking, how quickly does this stuff happen? And again, the best answer for this, in many cases, is the best answer in biology. It really depends. If life changes because of what the environment does, then how quickly speciation happens, well, it depends on what the environment does. When the idea of evolution first was sort of articulated, Charles Darwin cited the ideas of Charles Lyell talking about uniformitarianism, the idea that forces that shaped the earth long ago are still shaping it today. And the idea was the earth is old and it's always changing. It's this gradual, slow process of accumulated change. Well, if that's the way the earth is changing, if certain rivers are carving out canyons slowly over time, well, then life's going to change slowly. So if the environment changes slowly, relatively speaking, again, we're talking about on the orders of millions of years here, then life is going to evolve at sort of roughly the same pace, because natural selection is what drives those changes in populations. But what if life changes more rapidly? Well, that's the notion of punctuated equilibrium. The idea of punctuated equilibrium is that life is sort of at an equilibrium. There's not a lot of change that occurs for long stretches of time, but then it's punctuated by lots of rapid change. And that's what we see with the Cambrian explosion. All the big multicellular animals that we see today all arose over a relatively short period of time, over a handful of million years, about 500 million years ago. So there was a massive die-off where lots of organisms died. That opened up opportunity, resources, niche space, and then in a relatively short amount of time, again, we're still talking on the order of millions of years, about 500 million years ago, there's what's called an adaptive radiation, and then the phyla of animals, the different categories of animals, from sponges to the vertebrates that we see today, they all emerged around the same time. So that's the notion of punctuated equilibrium. There's not a lot of change for a long period of time, but then if there's rapid changes on the Earth, well, then that leads to rapid speciation or rapid change. Some researchers are looking at the evolution of modern humans, and what they are thinking is there were periods in East Central Africa where there was 100,000 years of heavy rains, 100,000 years of drought, 100,000 years of heavy rains. Now, 100,000 years, that's a lot of lifetimes, right? Human lifetimes. But that is enough change that occurred under a relatively short amount of time to lead to a need to be able to adapt relatively quickly, and having a big old brain ended up being helpful for that. Again, how quickly speciation occurs, it's really going to depend on what the environment's dictating. So here are our takeaways. We can define species in different ways, whether it's the biological species concept, can they produce fertile offspring? That's our best. You have the morphological species concept, what features do they have or not have? Or again, you go back to the paleontological species concept. What do the fossils tell us? Again, we can sort of see where morphological and paleontological species definitions, they're a little fraught. But if we can go back to can they produce fertile offspring, then we're feeling a lot more confident. There are many ways to lead to the reproductive isolation that would cause the creation of new biological species, whether they're pre-zygotic barriers or post-zygotic barriers.